Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Several weeks ago, I was looking on LinkedIn and I came across an article, and the article was History of Networking or something along those lines. And it was a good article. It really was a good article. It took people right from the start of the article, what they deemed to be the start of networking, and brought it up to modern times and talked about LinkedIn and Facebook and all sorts of stuff like that. And so it was a good article. It was a lengthy article. But I found it to be interesting because it started in the 1950s, if I recall. It was almost as if we didn't know what networking was before 1950. And I'm not being critical of the author or anybody, but it's just, to me, that was very curious that I'm sure they sourced it. Maybe they went to ChatGPT to have the article written. I don't know. But networking's really been around for a long time. Networking is as old as time. Recorded time, so one of my friends says it's older than dirt. And I don't think it's quite that old, but it's been around. It's been around a while. We've networked. That's how humans got to where humans are, is networking. And so today, being July 3rd, the day before the 4th of July, our Independence Day, I wanted to share a story about Betsy Ross. Just a little bit of background. That was probably 10, 15 years ago. I had an intern working for me, and she had a roommate and said, "Hey, what do you, is there, do you know somebody who would be willing to hire my roommate? She's trying to build her resume." And I kind of looked at my budget, and it's like, it doesn't really cost a lot to have interns around. So I brought this second person on. The money wasn't a problem, right? The money was there. It was, a couple of months in the summer, and glad to help. But the problem was just finding work for people to do. And that was the stress for me. I didn't want somebody just to come in here and sit and twiddle their thumbs and say, "Yeah, just build your resume on my back." I wanted them to learn some stuff. So coming up with stuff was difficult. One of the things I had them come up with was I would give them historical figures and say, "Okay, how did this happen?" And one of the questions was, well, how did George Washington meet Betsy Ross? We all know the story. Well, we understand, or at least we understand Betsy Ross's contribution to American history. That's pretty well known. She was the person who sewed the first American flag. And that's where it stops. But there's always more to the story, isn't there? There's always a little bit more to how things kind of unfold. And I think there are lessons in there. Well, I know there are lessons in there. I learned from those sorts of things. But just to take you back, this all goes back. The whole need for a flag goes back to New Year's Day on 1776. The Continental Army was under siege in Boston, and the British Army had basically taken over. And not everybody in the colonies was for declaring independence. There were people called the Loyalists. The Loyalists supported Great Britain, and they were circulating a speech that King George had written, offering the Continental forces favorable terms if they stopped fighting. And George Washington ordered the Grand Union flag to be raised in support of the colonies, basically saying, "Hey, King George, screw you. We're going to be independent." And so he raised the flag, what was called the Grand Union flag. The problem with the flag is that the flag combined symbols of both Britain and America on it, and it was confusing. And there were a lot of people on both sides. The people who were against the loyalists and the people who were, I guess, the separatists, the people who were trying to declare independence, the American, the people who were behind having the American colonies be their own entity. It was confusing. On the flag, there was the two crosses, familiar crosses. There was the St. George's cross was on there, and St. Andrew's for Scotland. So it was confusing to people. And there were people like, okay, we're surrendering. And the reality is the Continental Army didn't know that this speech was out there circulating. The loyalists were like, well, the speech is out there, and now this flag's gone up. Is that a surrender symbol? And the Continental Army didn't even know that the speech was being circulated. So George Washington realized he had an issue with the flag. Plus, at the time, every colony had their own flag. Everybody had their own little allegiance. Hence, we became the United States, and not just, well, we are one country, but we're the United States of America. And so there was just, we're trying to pull together to declare our independence, to be independence, and fight this unified battle. And we don't have a unified flag to operate under. So in May or June of 1776, George Washington and two other men went to see Betsy Ross. And originally they came in and they had actually had a 6-point star that they wanted to use. And Betsy Ross showed them how they could have a 5-point star. So she was kind of the originator of the 5-point star. And so that's them coming to see Betsy Ross. Well, Betsy Ross has her own story. She's got her own origin story, if you will. If you're a lover of Marvel, everybody's got origin stories. But she was born the eighth of 17 children, and her maiden name was Griscom, Griscom. And actually, she was born on January 1st, 1752. But her parents were merchants, but from a religious standpoint, her parents were Quakers, and Quakers had had differing beliefs about things. They, for the most part, they didn't drink, was part of it, but the big thing is that they didn't believe in retaliating against evil. So their whole notion of this war against Britain, King George, excuse me, they weren't for it at all, and that was the entire church and everybody in the church. And so, they were somewhat pacifists in the war effort, and so they were kind of looked down upon. Probably supported by the loyalists, and the people who were looking to separate and become independent, looked down upon them. But the other thing about the Quaker Church is that they looked at it was modern in the sense that it looked at boys and girls, men and women as equals, and so the girls went off to school, and that wasn't always the case throughout history. But the girls went off to school, and that's where Betsy learned to sew. And then when she graduated, um, her parents wanted her to be more than just they wanted her to do something, and so they connected her with a woman who had an upholstery shop. So she was good at sewing, and she was good at needlepoint, and so they just sent her off to be an apprentice with this well-known couple, or this, well, not couple, but it was a man by the name of William Webster, who was a local upholsterer, figuring, okay, she would learn the business. She would, learn about sewing jobs, and I'm not sure what got upholstered then. They probably didn't have couches like we have couches, but one of the things that she became known for was flag making. At any rate, while serving in this apprenticeship, she met this gentleman by the name of John Ross, and he was the son of an Episcopal rector at Christ Church. And right away, she's fallen in love with this guy, and he's an Episcopalian. And you know, there, uh, you think we're divisive, right? There's no, there's no intermixing of faith. If you're an Episcopalian, you marry into Episcopalian. If you're Quaker, you marry into Quaker. Well, certainly the Quakers were like that. Listen, You find yourself a nice Quaker boy and you marry and you get settled down, and that's just the way it's going to be. And you just follow lockstep with how we are. Um, in fact, Betsy had three sisters that had already married non-Quakers, and they were excommunicated. But that gave Betsy the courage to basically say, I'm in love. This guy's great. I'm going to marry him. And life rolls on. And it did. But she was excommunicated. Shortly after getting married, they read her out of the church. And that was the end of it. And we it's interesting. I've known this story for a while. We kind of look at the story and say, oh, geez, how old fashioned that is. But if you get a chance, listen to episode 608 of the Networking RX podcast. And I released it on June 21st. I interview a woman by the name of Sabrina Victoria. I won't get into her story. Go listen to the episode. It's titled "How to Rebuild Your Network from Scratch." That's pretty much what happened to Sabrina Victoria. Uh, it wasn't even 20 years ago that this happened. And again, I won't get into the story, but she was read out of her church, read out of her entire family. I'll leave it at that. You can listen to the story. It's a very interesting story of somebody who was basically pushed out of a church and rebuilt her whole network into really a very neat empire. But listen to the story. So here is Betsy. She's married this John Ross guy, and they've started their own upholstery shop. The first one wasn't going to have anything to do with her because she's been excommunicated. She's essentially starting over. And one of the places she started over because she's, she got kicked out of her church. It doesn't mean, hey, I don't believe in God. It's just I need another place to worship. And because John Ross's family was very involved with Christ Church, the Episcopalian Church, that's where they ended up. And in those days, you had where you sat, the pew, it was kind of assigned to a family. And as luck would have it, George Washington and Betsy Ross were essentially sitting next to one another every Sunday when they went to church. And that's how Betsy Ross met George Washington. And for me, the networking story in all of this is networking happens in all sorts of unusual places. This is not I'm not encouraging or discouraging people from going to church. That's somebody else's gig. It's not my gig to do that. But it's very interesting that this is where it happened. It happened at church. And networking does happen at all sorts of unusual places. And obviously, this is how one of the ways that networking was kind of, as I term in the title of this, was sewn into American history. If Betsy Ross stays with the Quaker Church, maybe somebody else designs the flag. I'm not saying that, but her place in history, and the 5-pointed star, it was very much Betsy Ross. And that was all brought together because people coming together, and really finding opportunity in unusual places. We think about networking as this thing that happens at, air quotes, networking events. And the rest of the time, it's just like life goes on, and really networking is kind of a 24/7 thing. Even today, it's a 24/7 thing. We're constantly building relationships with people. And it's, it's something to think about as you're kind of, moving around and talking with people and at various things. For my American friends, my friends in the United States, tomorrow's the 4th of July. You're going to be at parties. Or maybe tonight, you're going to meet people. Those are networking opportunities. And I'm not saying you need to have cards with you. Maybe I always have cards with me. But be open to the notion that there are going to be people that are going to turn into things. When I was working at my prior job as a tax consultant, I was invited to a party, and I happened to run into somebody, and I worked for an accounting firm that did audits, and they basically said, yeah, we're not happy with our auditors. And it's just a simple little comment on a Saturday night. And that just led me into a conversation that Monday with a boss and connecting with this company. And we got the assignment, we got the audit. And it was just being open to the notion that networking opportunities are everywhere. You just need to open your eyes.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.